I'm incredibly excited to be joined today by the Oscar-nominated directors and producers of the documentary feature, The Alabama Solution. Andrew Jarecki is best known for the groundbreaking Oscar-nominated feature capturing the Friedmans and the Emmy-winning HBO series The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. Charlotte Kaufman is a producer on The Jinx Part 2, and her previous work includes Hidden Alibi, featured in the Netflix series The Innocence Files. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
And
I've
Yeah.
never done a PII before,
Yeah.
a parent-involved interview.
Okay, I was wondering what a PII was. I think I'll definitely steal that phrase and put it in. Yeah.
All right, we're going to do
Might be a
this.
PI, a private investigative parrot. You originally went into Easterling to film a religious revival, not an investigation into Alabama's whole brutal system of incarceration. When did you both realize this wasn't just a prison story, but a 6-year-long collaboration with incarcerated leaders? And how did that realization change what the film needed to be structurally and ethically?
Well, I never go into anything thinking that I know what the story is going to be. I don't think we really were drawn to filming Beautiful Revival Meeting, as lovely as it is. We had strong indications at that point that there were terrible things happening in the Alabama prison system. And I was lucky enough to meet that Chaplain Browder, who was the first Black prison chaplain in the state of Alabama, appointed by George Wallace. And he was almost 80 when I met him. And I said, I'm really curious about what's going on in the prisons. And he said, well, why don't you just come in with me as a volunteer? And I said, well, they're not going to let us in because we're filmmakers and it's a very notoriously secretive system. And he said, I'm not suggesting what you do. I just think you need to come and learn what's going on in there, and you'll meet some people and you'll come away with your impressions. So we'll just go in and we distribute food packages and hygiene packages, and they let us sort of talk to the men. And so I came back to New York and sat with Charlotte, and I said, I have no idea what we're going to see, but quite sure it's not going to be good. We had no idea how involved it was going to be. We had no idea how eye-opening and disturbing it was going to be. So when we went into Easterling, I think we always had the view that we were trying to penetrate the walls of secrecy in that system.
Do you want to add anything, Charlotte?
yeah, well, and I think we went into it with an open mind and understanding that access to prisons is very rare. To be able to go in with cameras. Anyone who's worked on any film or documentary that deals with the prison system has dealt with the bureaucratic hurdles to get into these facilities. So when you're given the opportunity as like a journalist, as a filmmaker, you kind of just take it and then you see, okay, what able to observe when you're actually on the ground. And then what we heard that day was diverged so much from what they were trying to show us that it kind of, I think, compelled us to want to keep investigating. And then you realize that so much of this system, both in Alabama, but also nationally, is built on a constructed myth, basically, that incarceration makes us safer and that incarceration fights crime. And I think as soon as we realized that there was a way to really break through that myth and to show people like what's actually happening behind the walls, it almost felt like, and that being through actually engaging with people through contraband cell phones and through suspended dialogue, it almost would have been unethical to not do that. Because then at that point, you are just upholding the very damaging, lie that has allowed the system to be perpetuated. So we felt like it was, from everyone we spoke to at the beginning, the message was clear. Like, let us speak. Let us be the one to explain what's happening. Like, show what's actually happening behind these walls. Don't just rely on the state's story. So I think so there was like an ethical feeling of we have to get beyond the state authorized narrative. But then, of course, the people who are in the film are living under an authoritarian power. And they have to take risks to participate, to tell their story, to be a whistleblower. And they've made the calculation that, that ultimately appealing to the fourth estate, appealing to the public opinion is a mechanism of safety. It is a way to push back, and that, Andrew always says democracy dies in darkness and so do people.
Mm-hmm.
But yet the the risk that they have to take to speak out becomes a great point of care and thought and constant dialogue and returning to the conversation, making sure this is still the equation that they believe, that they want to keep talking. And then of course, after the film comes out, there's all sorts of considerations to take regarding encouraging whistleblower defense funds so that they can have lawyers visit them, that they can have lawyers respond to things. But yeah, the ethical questions around telling a story within an authoritarian system, are really complicated. And I think as Americans and living in a democracy, we haven't really had to tackle that when we're telling we think we haven't had to tackle that when we're telling stories about our own country. But I think we're reaching a time now where we're more and more going to be having to navigate situations where speaking the truth comes with a lot of complications and risk.
Yes, it is such a powerful film. It is so eye-opening, jaw-dropping, and important. The investigative work you've done, the way you've brought the voices forward in this horrifically authoritarian state prison system. Ted and I love the film, and we're always interested in how form and content align. And you've spoken to this a little bit, but you do it so well in the film. And so much, as you've said, of the film's power comes from these images shot by incarcerated men on contraband phones. It's very, very raw, emotional. You cannot unsee what you see, unlearn what you learn. How did you think about integrating that material so it didn't just feel like evidence and became the cinematic language of the film, because it's very cinematic?
I mean, for me, I was very concerned up front that it was going to be hard to tell a story using a lot of cell phone footage because it just might be enervating for the audience. It might be too much for them to take in. And we would get a beautiful piece of an interview with Kinetic, and it would be too difficult to extract enough moments where we had clear video and clear audio. And so one of the things that we had to do was to go back and try to get as much of it as possible, as many of the pieces of wisdom that we hear from these men in a form that was understandable. But then it kind of magically did come together, and it was a tremendous amount of work, and our editor, Paige Marcella, is really extraordinary. But it was a struggle because we also knew that the graininess of the footage was part of the story. The medium is the message. And in this case, the difficulty of extracting a signal, the difficulty of getting access to these minds that are incarcerated was part of what they deal with all the time. Just imagine them trying to explain something to their families and having to do it on a wall phone where they're being surveilled, and trying to talk to their lawyer when they know that there's somebody listening to their conversation with their lawyer. So that interference, I think, mirrors the experience of them trying to communicate writ large. And then I think as we started to watch it, it became clear that the constriction, the natural constriction of the frame and that vertical video created a little bit of a box. It created a little bit of, for the audience, that feeling of claustrophobia that the men feel all the time. So I think it was clear once we had enough of it together that there was a way to do that, and also balance it with very beautiful shooting, and Charlotte shot a lot of amazing stuff. Nick Krause, other DP, would go to Alabama and just shoot lovingly and shoot broadly and get moments of the state that gave you the perspective on what it's like in the free world. But I think the tension between being out in the world, seeing Steve Marshall's incredible grand office in this giant white building, the state capitol, and then going to the dank and frightening and medieval interior that's lived by the men that he's got locked up, was part of the experience for the audience.
It's also interesting because the cell phone footage is a little over 30% of the film, but it feels like it's a lot more. And I think that's because of the power of it, that it's so precious, like it's so unique, and we don't often get to see inside these prison systems. So when you do, it really stays with you. But we were careful about not overdoing it in terms of showing the trauma and the violence and the horrors, because there is the risk of sort of putting your audience through the same experience that the guards are put through on a daily basis that actually ends up desensitizing them. So we definitely although I'm sure for the audience, it feels like you're just being met with like wave after wave of upsetting and disturbing images. We tried to restrict ourselves in some ways, and also wanted to make sure that use the cell phone image as much as possible, not in just like a completely expository way. Like, let me just dictate to you what's happening. Now I'm going to cut to B-roll, but to try and have it emerge naturally from from actual developments in the story and in the lives of the people who you're getting to know. So, for example, we could have done something where they just talk about drugs in the reality of drugs in prisons. And then you cut to footage of people, struggling with drugs. But we wanted to we sort of gave ourselves the rule that if we were going to discuss sort of systemic things like that, it had to come up through a character driven plot point. And then it's less about like clinical evidence. And now it becomes about the experience of a human. And I think that speaks to a different part of us as the audience member and allows us to have more empathy versus, these are just statistical data points and this is just the image that's matched to it. Is that, yeah.
Those were very deep answers, very thoughtful. Was there a certain point at which you could see that the incarcerated men were not only subjects, but in a way co-authors, as you've said, of this narrative? And then how did that decision affect credits, voiceover, whose perspective drives different acts of the film?
I think that immediately it was clear, like our first conversations with them, it was very clear that this would be the source of a lot of our understanding. This would be they were going to be the people who could help us understand what was happening inside the prison system most deeply. And Melvin Ray said to us early on, like we asked him, what do journalists and filmmakers and whatnot usually get wrong about telling stories about the prison system? And he said that usually they present us as a statistic and not as an actual person living a full life with ups and downs and with agency and who have projects and are fighting for things. And also, and we included this in the film for this purpose. He also said at one point, we asked, should we just go off video if you would feel better about that? And he said, no, I don't want them to just hear my voice. I want them to see my whole self. And that became really a sort of driving anchor for us, that the secrecy of the prison system isn't just about hiding the crimes that are being committed by the prison. It's also about hiding the humanity and the brilliance and the leadership. Because once you hide that, it's a lot easier to accept the system and to say, oh, well, those are all just criminals. I'm okay with that happening. But when you actually get to speak to people and connect with people, that's a lot harder to sustain such an abusive project. So I think from the very beginning, we realized that they were going to be a big part. Telling their stories and allowing them to be the experts was going to be a big part of the film. And then, it's not just them. There were dozens of other men that we spoke to who provided us insight, who provided us footage and material. And, there's a card at the beginning alluding to that. And then Melvin and Kinetic were always very adamant that we had to make sure that was clear in the film. So there are parts in the film where they say it's not just us, it's dozens of other people. That's why so many people are recording, because it really is like an effort across all the facilities to document and to make sure that the truth of what they're living in comes out. And then on the flip side of that, we also have Sandy Ray, who led us into her life and, deeply trusted the filmmaking process. And so I think having those two stories that we're following at the same time, both on the outside of the prison and on the inside, and being able to feel the narrative and the voice from inside and outside is sort of what I think is also really important. It's not just inside, it's also how family members are dealing with the obfuscation and the sort of disrespect and abuse outside. So I don't know, Andrew, if you have any.
Yeah, I think that the sort of North Star, a big guiding principle for us, was that it all had to be intimate, that in our conversations with the men or our conversations with Sandy, that if we could, as much as possible, allow those conversations to evolve and allow those things to happen in a very personal way, that we would be hearing things that were not, platitudes or that we weren't going to be taking complex feelings and thoughts and trying to simplify them for the audience. because there's so many conflicting feelings. You know, you have somebody like Sandy Ray, who's the mother of Stephen Davis, who's killed by guards, by one particular guard in the film. And we could have done an interview with her for an hour and, you know, called her and asked her if we could come over. But we ended up on her porch because when Charlotte and I went to the hospital on this tip from Melvin and we found Stephen dead, that he had already passed away, we didn't know whether they had told his parents, because often, especially if there's suspicious circumstances or there's a guard involved, they don't tell the family that their loved one has died, or they wait until they can kind of scramble the witnesses so the information's not available anymore. You could hear in the film all the efforts that the guards and the internal investigation division go through to obfuscate and to make it impossible to investigate. So we went to Sandy's house first and foremost to see if she knew. And then she was so, you know, she had been with her son just a few hours before we met her, and she was holding his hand when he died. And the fact that she was not only willing, but so welcoming to us and said, if you guys are making a film about this, I don't want this to happen to any other mother, and I want to participate in whatever way I can. And then she pointed out that there were no hotels in Uniontown where she lives. And so she said, you know, people are calling me right now from the prison and they're lying to me. You know, I want you to capture this. You have to see what's happening in real time. And so she said, well, since there are no hotels, I have this spare room. And then Charlotte just like grabbed her duffel bag from the car and she moved into Sandy's house for a couple of weeks. And that's one of the reasons why that material is so intimate, because Charlotte has you know, it's somebody that people trust because she's a deeply sincere person, and that you get that in every moment of talking to her. And then she spent enough time with Sandy that she was able to be present for these incredibly powerful and difficult moments and just be sort of part of the furniture. And Sandy felt comfortable having her there. So some of it is just the time and the care that you take with the subjects to get that level of intimacy.
It's such a service you've given all of us, really, to have taken this on, and to have the level of skill and craft that you bring to the film, because it actually has an almost thriller-like build. It's very gripping and propulsive, and you have these major sequences in the ICU and the strike and the retaliation, and you're working with these real lives under extreme risk, and show so much respect and consideration for your subjects. How was it on your mind, this question of, you know, not turning a humanitarian crisis into true crime entertainment and yet needing to make this work reach audiences everywhere? How did you figure out that careful calibration with your pace and your reveals and your cliffhangers and all of it?
Andrew was very, I think I've learned a lot from him about the power of I don't want to call it being a thriller, but I think what you're no, I mean it is. We are proud that it can feel like a thriller. And I think the way that the reason that is so important that it feels like a thriller at times is because the moments when it does, that's when you're coming up against the power structure. That's when you're realizing that it isn't just people who are being victimized because of like systemic, you know, amorphous failures. It's actually because there are human beings who are trying to obstruct and obfuscate the truth that are driving the systemic failure. And so Andrew was so good at making sure that we really leaned into that, and that, that's why, that moment when we're going into the hospital and you're realizing that, that there are people who are really uncomfortable, and saying, or, you shouldn't be filming this, or making sure we gave space for those moments, because that is a reality of living and working within this system, that it is a massive cover up. And so I think, that's, if you watch The Jinx, if you watch, Catfish, or lots of Andrew's work, like he is good at drawing the audience into the larger powers that are trying to subvert the truth. But then I think we also balanced it with making sure that it didn't just become about the gotcha moments, or that ultimately the heart of it is the people that are that are navigating these thriller-like moments and, making space for that. But
Yeah.
I also Andrew and there was a thing that Andrew always said, which was, if we make the saddest movie in the world, no one's gonna wanna watch it. And now we've done a disservice to the subject matter. You know, and then we've also left out the sort of heroism of pushing back against this power system. So he had a should I Smith nose?
Yeah, yeah. It was like a mnemonic device. It was, we had this thing, I have a blackboard in my office and I always like write stuff on it when we're talking or debating. And like very early, I wrote Smitwit Knows, which stood for how do we not make the saddest movie in the world that no one ever sees? And I guess the feeling was that there were really three principles. One was we needed to really care about our subjects. And that was answered very quickly when we started talking to Melvin and Kinetic and Raoul, because they're just people that your heart immediately goes out to. And they're also so thoughtful about the system. They're not just saying, well, this is what happened to me today. They're saying this is why it's happening. This is what the societal issues are. And this is what the racial issues are. And, they're very deep. So the first thing I think was satisfied by that. And then the second thing was we had to have a kind of access that was something the audience had never seen before, and that would draw the audience in. And then the third thing was we had to be on the hunt. We had to be revealing things. We had to have the experience present for the audience that we had had making the film. When Charlotte and I get in the car, we get this text message from Melvin Ray saying somebody had been beaten very badly and they're at UAB hospital. And we went to the hospital and we made these discoveries. That was something that we felt the audience needed because A, it would show how impossible it is to get information out of the system. Sandy Ray calling over and over and nobody calling you back. And also, I think there's just always this driving feeling when you're making it that you're not just making a story, you're taking responsibility for the portrayal of people whose lives are in jeopardy. And you want to make change. You want your film to have an impact. You want to pull the covers off of this. And if the story didn't play strongly as a film, it's going to go the way of every other thing that you see on television or have some exploitative prison thing that you see. We needed to make something that the audience would feel very strongly. So we needed to keep them engaged.
And I think, we showed very, very early on, like in 2020 or 2019, we showed some like colleagues and other filmmakers some of the footage we'd been gathering. And when they saw Stephen Davis, the story of Stephen Davis, they said, this is a film. Like, you just investigate the death of Stephen Davis. This is enough here. Like, why are you still filming? Why are you still documenting? This can be its own standalone piece. And I think if we had done that, then we would have just done a true crime story. And it would have just been a murder investigation within the context of mass incarceration. And so we kept going, for 6 years. And I think at times we'd think like, are we crazy? How are we going to make all of these different stories come together in one feature? Can they be in dialogue with each other? But we very much did not. As you were saying, Vanessa, like we did not want to just make a true crime story. We wanted to tell a larger story about like human nature and resilience and corruption of the soul and corruption of people. But luckily we had an amazing editor to help us with all of that.
You both answered these questions so well together separately. I imagine it's an easy collaboration, but I'm curious, at times maybe it's not easy to be co-directors and co-producers, or were there ways, do you feel you elevate each other's work? How does your collaboration work?
I mean, I think I would say two things. One is I can't believe how fortunate I was to start working with Charlotte. Honestly, I don't know how this film could have been made without her, and the conflict of which there's plenty in the edit room and elsewhere. I don't think it ever goes to the place of thinking, we're really, our interests on this film are different, or one of us is trying to make a different film than the other one. But the creative conflict is so essential. Because, you've got to put yourself in the position of the audience all the time and say, is this going to work for them? Are they going to stay with us in this difficult material? And so there's always a debate. I would say if you look at that photograph of Stephen Davis, that's one of the most disturbing photographs in a film that I've ever seen. We knew that it had to be in the film. We knew that there was a reason why his brother had taken that photograph, even though they were admonished and told that they weren't allowed to bring their cell phones in. And so he took it he says, when the cops were out back sleeping, he snapped that photograph. There were so many times when we adjusted the amount of time that that photograph was on screen. And it's really because you never want to be exploiting an image like that. A long time we were making the film, I couldn't watch that image because I felt it skewed my feelings so much in that moment, or I became so emotional watching it. So I would literally, I don't think I've ever done anything like this, but I would just put my head down or I'd look away when that image came up. But we and Paige and our, we had a brilliant supervising editor, Richard Hankin, who I've collaborated with in the past. There was so much debate about how long that photograph should be up because we didn't want to give the audience more than they could handle, but we didn't want to have it be a glimpse. It needed to be seen. But that's an example of something where if I'm not in a debate with Charlotte about that, I don't know. I don't know what happens with that image in the film. So I just always felt like it was these constant check-ins and debates, and sometimes you could be hard on each other and be like, oh, well, you probably just want the film to be like that, and then that gets into the territory of really like, not, and you never want to be like, you never want to be like bullying each other, but we both can do that. Like when Charlotte doesn't like something, and she can do it very politely. And I probably do it in a more awkward male way. But I also think that the difference between us is really important. I think our different backgrounds and the fact that we're different genders and that we were able to also have a number of co-producers. Alex Duran is somebody who'd been incarcerated for 12 years between Rikers Island and Sing Sing. Everybody was in debate. Everybody was always weighing in and saying, and I always like try to have unanimity in the end because nobody wants to put the film out there and have one, especially in this situation. I had never co-directed anything before, but it was, I think both of us saying like, we're going to embrace each other's differences and we're just going to battle it out and the product will be better for it.
Also, from my end, when we started working together, we just never discussed credit. Like it was just we just started working together. And the fact that Andrew invited debate and created a space where I was encouraged to be difficult sometimes and encouraged to push back. That like I saw Andrew's films when I was young and I was like, that's what I want to do. Like I saw The Jinx and there was a scene with Zach Stewart Pontier, who's a executive producer of The Jinx, and like up at the whiteboard, and he was like taking directions from Andrew, and like they were trying to solve their mystery. And I was like, how do I get to do that? Like that's the thing. Uh, and so then to be able to like work with Andrew, and then from like basically day one, it was a not like I'm the authority, but a very much taking everyone's opinions and having debate. And that takes like a very confident director and storyteller to not feel threatened by strong opinions. And yeah, and I feel like incredibly lucky to have stepped into that environment. And to also, by the way, like never say, oh, it's not worth pursuing this avenue, or it's not worth going down this rabbit hole. Like I had that experience on other projects, where there's not the time, there's not the budget, but just like always feeling like we're on the same page about how everything is worth asking questions about, and that same like sort of investigative obsession and impulse. Yeah, it was very, yeah. And oh, I'll also mention another thing. Andrew was reading this book by Barry Diller. What was it called?
It's his, I think it's called Who Knew? And it's his brilliant autobiography.
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes up is the idea that conflict is essential to art. And he would like, sometimes I'd be like, am I arguing too much? Do I need to like tone myself down? Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to be so like difficult or whatnot? And when he was reading that book, he'd be like, no, this is all part of the process. It's okay. Be okay with conflict and discomfort. And I think as a woman, that's like I'm so grateful for that lesson, because that's not in my instinct to be comfortable with upsetting people sometimes. So I think that was, yeah, I feel so grateful for that and lucky.
In that Barry Diller book, he talks about Katharine Hepburn having said to him years earlier, show me a calm, respectful, collected movie set, and I'll show you a boring movie. And I think it is really in this, it's in the nature of it, because you're really talking about like, what are these lines that you're crossing? And,
Yeah.
what's something that you're willing to broach? There were so many things obviously that couldn't find their way into the film ultimately, and we were really passionate about. There were entire storylines because we had so many terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of material. We knew that we didn't want experts in the film, but we needed to talk to experts because we
Mm.
sort of wanted to vet our assumptions when it came to things like the corruption of the state and like following the money. That's something that you can go down that path endlessly because there's so many hands out. And when the state is trying to build a new prison, when the DOJ said, don't bother. That's not the problem with your prisons. It's not the physical plant. It's the corruption and it's the brutality. It's the culture of violence. I was very driven to get to the bottom of that. And we actually shot some incredible material of bond salesmen pitching financial advisors in investing in the new prison construction program because they needed to float a bond in order to raise that money, and watching them do backflips to explain why this was going to be really good for humanity, when really what they were doing was just trying to make money off of human
Mm.
lives being destroyed in these institutions. And losing that, not being able to put that in the film was pretty heartbreaking, but it wouldn't fit in the film. But that's an example of something where you do so much work to capture something and you don't really want to let people off the hook. And so it sort of kills you to lose it. But I think that's the kind of thing that's in some ways the most valuable thing about having a collaborator like Charlotte is you can just have this conversation endlessly and be like, yeah, but where would we put it? And then Paige is like, we already have 10 pounds of sugar in a 5-pound bag. Like, how are we possibly going to, fit in this additional thing? And then one of us would always be like, well, let's just cut it and let's see what it looks like. And Paige would sometimes say, I'm not cutting anything else that's not going to be in the movie. And I know what's going to be in the movies. I thought it was a very healthy but intense collaboration.
And so how did you land on the film's final structure and time frame? You've both spoken to what you wanted to keep in, what you didn't want it to be too narrowly focused around, and why. But to achieve all you've achieved in one film, how did you arrive at that final decision?
I think it was like 1,000 decisions. It was like 1,000 micro decisions. Charlotte was very early on was very confident that the men could tell the story. And I was very nervous that we weren't going to be able to get enough material and that it wasn't going to be clear enough. And we were going to be relying so much on that. So I think we wanted the same thing, but I was probably, more of a voice of like, well, we've got to get this covered multiple ways. We might need somebody to tell us this story, or this aspect of the story. And then, I think the film, I'm curious about Charlotte's view of this, but I think the film knows what it is supposed to be. And so, if you really listen and watch and gather all the material you have and go through it again and again and again and see where the holes are, eventually, you get the feeling the film is sort of just like shaking off all the stuff that's not the Alabama solution. And if you're listening, maybe you get left with the essence of what the film needs to be.
Yeah, I think also because it interweaves so many different storylines, you don't know exactly what the order is going to be and when you're going to jump off from one story and jump back into the next one. And so sometimes the editing process is not linear. I mean, it's not linear editing, that's what they call it. But it's like you build these chunks of clay and they're very rough, and then you put them next to each other and you step back and you're like, okay, how are the different lumps playing together? And then you might rearrange them and then you go back in for another refining of the scenes and then you step back and then so it's like a very almost mystical process. Like you can feel very insecure in it sometimes because you cannot like just put it down on paper what the beginning, middle, and end is. And you really have to have like a lot of faith and work through a lot of anxiety just to keep trying to make it work and hope that it's gonna all eventually feel propulsive in like one story. And I think that a lot of our decision making about which aspects of our investigation to include and which not, because a lot of it didn't make it in the film, was around like how they speak to each other. The fact that Melvin Ray told us about the death of Stephen Davis, we had done multiple investigations into deaths that were this detailed. But ultimately, the fact that Melvin Ray tells us about Stephen Davis and our investigation was pushed by the men already in the film that creates, make some of the decisions for us. And then towards the end, once the strike happens, that did feel like a resolution. Because the film, throughout the film, sort of what you're seeing is any mechanism of accountability or fail. And at first the people think the Department of Justice is going to come in and something might happen. And then by the time you get to the end of it, it's the people realizing no one's coming to save us. We have to take matters into our own hands. And I think that's also sort of a message that we want to leave the audience with. Like, we need to, as the people in this country, we're going to have to take matters into our own hands, and it's going to be collective action. And it's going to be, we can no longer rely on certain mechanisms of accountability. And yeah, so I think that the strike was just that when the strike happened, we felt like, okay, now we understand where this is all going, and we can stop. Like, this will be a resolution.
Right. And then, but it's this ongoing crisis in the prison systems in Alabama, in this country. And you've spoken to this moment in our political system being authoritarian too, or trending in that direction. And I know you both probably came into this with a sense of the impact it can have. Are you constantly having those impact conversations? And are you feeling now that you're in the Oscar race and campaigning that you're having an impact? And has your sense of what it can be evolved? Also, what can we do to make a difference? Because really, it is so impactful, your films. Watching it, you feel like terrorized. It's terrifying. It's horrifying to think what's going on in our prison systems, and what needs to be done to fix it is also challenging.
I mean, one thing I think that's worth pointing out is, unfortunately, what you see in the film has become much more widely problematic in the country, because the things that we're seeing, people being, men using cell phones to document brutality by authorities, to document criminal activity and horrible crimes by the authorities who are supposed to be keeping them safe. We're now seeing that played out in places like Minneapolis. And the fact that our guys are retaliated against for using cell phones to expose the horrors that are going on at the hands of the state is so chillingly similar to Alex Preddy getting killed for using a cell phone to document brutality by federal officers. And I wasn't very surprised that Kristi Noem had to come out with this statement saying that he was brandishing a weapon, even though she knew that he had a camera. And so that tells you that to an authoritarian administration, a camera is a threat automatically. And that's, I think, maybe dovetails into answering your other question, which is if we can use this material in this film to demonstrate for the public in Alabama and elsewhere, this is where this goes. Like, what you're not being allowed to see inside these black sites that are prisons or immigration detention centers, that this is where ultimately that lack of accountability leads. Unfortunately, this is sort of what people end up or can end up doing to each other when there's no journalists around, when there's no transparency, there's no ability for the public to see what's going on. Because Alabama can only get away with this if it's secret. Right. And ICE can only get away with it if it's secret. And of course, it has to be secret. You got to be wearing a mask, and you've got to, do it behind closed doors, or you've got to put people in a detention center and not allow people to come in and visit them, not allow people to video. As Kinetic says, the administration worries more about the phones than they do about what was recorded on the phones. And actually, there's just to add to the urgency of it, Kinetic has this line about, we've been taking life and death risks to get this information out while we still can. And part of, I think, what he means by this is that the administration wants to get rid of the phones. And actually, very recently, the new FCC chair has put forward new rules that would loosen prisons' ability to block cell phones, to use blockers. And again, they're looking at a prison system that's sort of in free fall. And their reaction to it is to say, how do we keep this information from getting out? How do we spend millions and millions of dollars to try to stop the information from flowing rather than trying to improve the underlying situation? Charlotte talks about what we're seeing in the country right now is incubated in the prison system. The experimentation and the testing the limits and saying, how bad can we make this and how little money can we spend on our prisons and how brutal can they be while the public is not paying attention? What can we do to prevent the public from seeing it? How much can we limit press access, for example? And if the public tolerates it, then the answer is, they're winning, right? That they're going to be able to make them worse and worse and worse. And this kind of culture of cruelty is going to grow because the public's not even allowed to see that these are human beings. There are people that see um, the film and sort of will awkwardly say, I guess I've just never spoken to an incarcerated person before, and like, I understand what they mean. Really, what I feel, I have compassion for that. They're feeling strong feelings about what they just saw. They're feeling betrayed by the government. We're spending $80 billion a year on these prisons and we're being told that they're making us safer. We're being told that the people in there are just horribly dangerous and thank God they're behind walls. And then you meet a Robert Earl Council or you meet a Melvin Ray or Raoul Poole, and the audience reaction is, I just never expected a person like that to be incarcerated. They seem so smart and vital. And so I understand why people watch the film and they feel that awkward feeling that they've never been allowed to talk to somebody who's incarcerated, because it would reveal that there are a lot of very beautiful, interesting, fascinating people in there. And it's not all, like Jeffrey Dahmers or people that are trying to do something terrible. And that would lead them to say, well, maybe we ought to really focus on rehabilitation. Maybe we ought to focus on trying to give people the tools to rejoin society when they get out. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised that there's such a high rate of recidivism when we are not preparing these people to be in society.
That was a fantastic answer.
This film, making the film was so difficult and intense. It was 7 years, but we had the feeling that once the film was out, that was when the work really starts in terms of making sure that it's actually does work for change and isn't just received passively as entertainment. So we've been really like, people are like, what's your next film? What are you working on now? Like, we don't have any space for that. Like, our time is being spent now ensuring that this film can be used as a tool for activists, for people in the space to, get in front of judges and lawyers and that takes a lot of groundwork. We've been having screenings across Alabama in places like stockyards and churches and community centers and for the bar association. And I think what's really motivating for us to focus on this is that the crisis has not slowed down. It has not stopped. Since 2019, there have been 1,500 people that have died in Alabama's prison system. And we've watched the rate of deaths double. And I was just in Alabama 2 days ago for a vigil of all of the lives that have been lost behind the bars. It's similar to the vigil that you see at the end of the film where they hold up the photos. And, it's just when you hear all of these mothers come up to the mic and explain what they went through, and it's this, you realize there are so many Sandy Rays, not only in this state, but like across the country. It's outrageous.
This is a picture of what Charlotte's saying. So this was just shot 2 days ago on the
Oh, wow.
Capitol, and all
Wow.
these people are there to
Amazing.
talk about their loved ones. These are people who have seen the film. These are
Wow.
people feeling like, they're not alone. Like, this has
No.
happened to a lot of people. And so the impact sort of campaign around the film, which is organized under this group called One for Justice, is quite elaborate and long term, and it involves legislative change, and it involves, publicity and letting people understand what's happening. And it's not all focused on the film, but the film can be a way to turbocharge the feelings. And so many people say the reason that the film matters is because there's no way to understand this without seeing it for yourself. People are just starved for information about what's really happening inside these prisons. And it's very hard for even the most conservative person to see this material and say, yeah, that's what I mean by tough on crime. This is not tough on crime. This is a horrific institutional, constitutional disaster. And so for us, I think It's not like, oh, we're going to do an impact campaign for a couple months around the release of the film, or we're going to do a bunch of screenings. It's like, we're going to be making a lot of trips to Alabama, and we're going to be working very closely with experts and with grassroots organizations, which we've been doing for months now. And it's really powerful to see the film shown not just to regular people in Alabama, and we have to use these screenings because not everybody has HBO and lots of people in Alabama don't. But we did the premiere of the film in Montgomery. It was sort of the Alabama solution was on the marquee. I have to say that line, which is Kay Ivy's favorite line, like, we're going to solve this. We need an Alabama solution. This is an Alabama problem. She hasn't used that phrase since the film came out. I think that all by itself is an indication of something. And frankly, she had no comment. Let me say it like this. The process of sort of like getting the film in front of like Oscar voters or being at Sundance, there's cognitive dissonance in this subject matter that we're dealing with. And then somebody saying we should have a cocktail party for your film or something like that. But at the same time, we know that the nomination was meaningful, and we know that it makes Alabama very uncomfortable if the film is embraced. And we know this in part because the governor had no comment about the film for a year. And then when it got nominated, she immediately came out with this kind of incredible, very Trumpy statement like the Oscars are for losers or something. And
No,
then she went
well,
on.
Oscars had a low bar was
Yeah,
her.
and then she goes on to say, not only is Kay Ivey is the greatest governor when it comes to prisons, and she's done more than any other governor in the state to improve the prison system. I mean, it's completely through the looking glass. But the fact that she reacted to the nomination indicates that this kind of public pressure really does matter. And they don't like it. They feel like they have to respond to it, even though they spend most of their time saying like, "Oh, we don't listen to the outside world." But nobody likes to have this kind of exposure. This is just not something that you want your grandchildren to see, or your spouse to see, that this is really what's going on at your job, or that this is what daddy spends his time doing. I hope that Steve Marshall's family watches this film and says, my father is presiding over death camps. That's what's happening. When he says, oh, I don't, I've been told that there's some systemic problem in all of our prison facilities. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. All right. Well, has he watched the film? I would really encourage him to watch the film.
One final thing I'll add is that we have on our website, www.thealabamasolution.com, we have a page, a take action page that has very clear steps on what people can do right now. Right now, we're running an effort to make a lot of noise about the men in the film to make sure they're protected, released from solitary confinement. And then we also have some other actions, large, aimed at bigger changes in the state.
But it's been effective also, I think. Even so far, we've seen that people who have seen the film are doing things like showing up at the Prison Oversight Committee meeting. Normally they have this meeting in a little tiny room and they sort of quietly talk about the prison problem among the legislators, and they don't really invite the public. The public's allowed to go. The last time they had one of these, there was like an overflow crowd and they had to move to a bigger venue for the thing. And I think it's just becoming harder and harder for the public officials to ignore that this is happening. If you can get this material in front of more people, they're motivated. They understand just how bad it is and how they've been prevented from looking inside.
Well, thank you both again for this wildly important work that must have been truly traumatizing to make. So I'm really happy you had each other and the team around you, and that you're both doing well and keeping this fight going and making a difference. Because if we can get some sense of justice in this country and some accountability for perpetrators in this country, I think it would really make a huge difference for democracy and everyone living here and around the world. So thank you.